When writers ask me why they give up after a good start, I tell them I think it's because it's probably not a good start to begin with. It's usually the bad starts that writers usually tend to give up on, which means the good start that you thought you had was really just the bad start you believed to be good. I know that sounds a little confusing. What I'm trying to say is it's the bad starts that are hard to build on, and the good starts entice a writer to keep writing. Therefore, your question should be, why is the start of my story so bad? And to answer that, we first need to understand what exactly makes a bad start. Well, there are several things, but three of them come to mind. One, a common problem and one that could have any writer giving up is creating poor characters, especially your protagonist, the main character. Two, then there's your setting. If it doesn't work well, if it's not believable to you or so elaborate that you find it too difficult to sustain, then there's another reason you might feel like giving up. And three, if your plot is something that you have no clue about or interest in, then you will either struggle through it or give up on it entirely. Time for another of my little tales. An old woman by the name of Aurelia had always believed that her nephew, Fritz, was partly responsible for conning her out of a great deal of money several years earlier. The truth is, Fritz had nothing to do with it. The young men whom he associated with had planned to wait until Aurelia was away for the weekend and then break into her safe and steal her valuable jewelry. But when they showed up, they didn't need to break into the safe because Fritz, as dumb-witted as he was, forgot to lock them back into the safe as per his aunt's instructions. The young thief simply found them sitting on a side table. Always believing that Fritz couldn't have been so absent-minded, she planned her revenge against him. She had recently had a new impenetrable safe installed in her house to hold all of her valuables. Her plan was to get her absent-minded nephew to lock himself inside the safe where he would eventually suffocate, so as to not have any fingers pointing her way after his dead body was discovered. She had him sign a document giving him complete ownership of her entire wealth, which would prevent her other family members from inheriting it. This way, people would believe that it was one of the other family members who had killed him and take the suspicion off of her. So, on the day she was leaving for a weekend trip, she gave Fritz the new combination to the safe and, like she had done before, instructed him to walk her valuables to the very back of the safe. She already knew that the door would start to close by itself, and by the time Fritz realized it, it would be too late for him to make it back to stop the door from sealing him inside. With no way of opening the door from the inside and no one due back at the house until the following Monday, Aurelia would finally have her revenge. But when she got back home on the following Monday afternoon, she stood in the doorway, shocked. Today, I'll talk about why a writer might give up on their story shortly after starting it. And then I'll tell you why Aurelia looked so shocked. Let's start with the most common problem: poorly developed characters. You can't expect to write a really good story with really poor characters, especially since your characters are what move your story. The most important being your main character. Since your main character, your protagonist, is who drives your story, if you start your novel with a weak or uninteresting protagonist who doesn't have a clear direction, then your start will be flawed and quite difficult for you to develop. Believe it or not, the development of your characters can either make or break your story. As I mentioned in earlier videos, Frankenstein and his monster are an example of good characters. Once Mary Shelley had developed these characters, the story practically took on a mind of its own, allowing Mary to enjoy the process of bringing these two characters to life through her story. But what if Dr. Frankenstein created a monster that was pure evil? What if all that monster did was to run around murdering people? Sure, there might be a story in there somewhere, but what would be the plot? In the story we have come to know, Frankenstein creates life from several different human body parts. As you can imagine, it is deemed a monster by society. But the beauty of this story is, although it looks like a monster, it is inherently kind, only taking on the facade of a true monster and killing after being subjected to the ignorance of society. In other words, the people who deemed him a monster were the ones who eventually turned him into one. But if the monster began as a monster, running around doing nothing more than scaring and killing people, it wouldn't fit within the parameters of the story Mary had envisioned and eventually had her giving up on it. It's not necessarily a bad story to have a monster doing nothing more than running around killing people, but since it's not what the author had in mind, it would be deemed a bad story for her. And another reason that has caused several writers to give up is the setting. Being so vital to the foundation of your story without one that works with your characters makes for a bad story. As I've mentioned in other videos, writers are always trying to come up with the next great story. And sometimes they forget the old adage, less is more. The best stories are the simplest stories of mice and men, two farm workers, best friends with little education, one mentally challenged and doesn't know his own strength, accidentally kills a woman and is then mercifully killed by his best friend. A simple story that has so much depth to it, used to teach in several schools. To Kill a Mockingbird, the life of two white siblings in the Deep South while their father defends a black man accused of raping a white woman. A simple story, and again with many angles, and also taught in schools. And then there were none. 10 people are lured to a secluded island in the 1930s for a past crime and then systematically killed off, one by one. A simple story masterfully taking place inside of the host's home. Not knowing who the killer might be, it allows the reader a strong avenue for discussion on crime and morality. Believe it or not, Agatha Christie, And Then There Were None, is the best selling crime novel of all time. But getting back to setting, I mentioned that this novel's setting was on a secluded island in a home. What if the setting was on a party train or an airplane or a spaceship? The thing is, it's all been done before, all mimicking this classic, And Then There Were None. Since Agatha Christie wrote her classic story, all of those settings have been used by many writers to murder one person after another. But what if Agatha Christie didn't use a secluded island home, but instead an artificial intelligent house from the future? Sure, there have been many movies about this type of story, but what if Agatha tried to do it back in the 1930s when she wrote And Then There Were None? Do you think it would have become the classic it became? I would say no. And I'm saying that because, one, Agatha would be out of her element. I began talking about the setting by stating that the best stories are the simplest stories. With Agatha trying to figure out how to write about a future she knows little or nothing about, she would find herself struggling to make it all make sense, taking away from the ease at which she creates her masterpieces. There's a reason why her novels are set in and around her time, and that's because she knows her time best. And two, It would no longer be the simple story about 10 people being killed off, one by one. The focus would no longer be just about who is doing the killing and why. It would need to include the complexities of a house run by a computer. The focus would be shared with the house. And if you've ever read And Then There Were None, the story takes place in a house but isn't about that house. In a story that shared the spotlight with a computer driven house, the setting would become so involved, changing the concept of the story that it may have Agatha frustrated and giving up. Again, part of the reason why that classic story did so well was because of the setting, a secluded house on a secluded island. It set the tone which made it possible for the characters to grow while allowing the plot to develop. Speaking of plot, it's the third reason writers might give up on their story. If you have little knowledge or little interest in your plot, you will be more likely to find it difficult to develop. Remember, your plot is like your roadmap through your story. Like a map, your plot shows the way from where you begin your story to the place where you end it. Let's say you were planning a trip somewhere. You have your bags packed, car all fueled up, and your GPS set to the address where you are traveling to. It's a 3 day drive, but after having a good first day, you wake up the following morning ready to resume your journey when your GPS stops working. You now have no way of knowing how to navigate your way to your final destination. Similarly, with the plot of your story, you have planned it out entirely. But after writing the start of your story, where your protagonist sets off on a journey to find hidden treasure in a remote part of the world, you misplace your notes, the notes you have been referring to as you write your story. You have your protagonist boarding a plane, but without your notes, you have nothing to follow and therefore lost as to where to take your protagonist once their plane lands. If you are unable to plot your way through your story because you no longer know where your story will lead, your characters are affected as well as your setting. You might find yourself feeling the urge to give up on that story and start another, or simply change that story altogether. Imagine planning out your story. You have the right characters, the right setting. The goal of your protagonist is clear, but you no longer have one very important ingredient. You've lost your way, and eventually, you've lost interest. Having interest in the story that you are writing is extremely important. Since you are the one writing the story, it doesn't matter how well you've prepared, how relatable your characters are, how appropriate your setting. If you no longer have the interest to write it, you will undoubtedly give up. It's human nature. We excel in areas of interest. The best doctors in the world are not people who have no interest in the medical field, just like the best racing car drivers are not people who have no interest in driving. The same holds true for writers. If you lose the interest to write your story, then it's unlikely that you will have the desire to keep writing. The few who force themselves on under those circumstances will find the experience unenjoyable and laborious to complete. When you sit down to write your next story, if you want to avoid a bad start, keep these three important aspects of character, setting, and the plot of your story in mind. And understand that your best chance of avoiding that bad start means you need to make certain that your characters, your setting, and your plot are able to work well together. Once they are, the success of your story will follow. And now I'll tell you the ending to the story I call Not for a Lack of Trying. Aurelia had a look of shock on her face because when she entered the room, she found Fritz sitting at the table with a sadness on his face. It turns out that he intended to unlock the safe and put his aunt's valuables inside, but Try as he might, he just couldn't remember the new combination, so he couldn't get the door open. But on the bright side, sitting there, he was finally able to remember the old combination to the old safe that he couldn't remember all those years ago, when his aunt instructed him to lock her jewelry away. And Aurelia's look of shock was because she realized that maybe he wasn't as stupid as she thought, because all of her wealth would remain in his name. Thanks for watching, and if you found anything that I said beneficial to you in any way, hit that subscribe button, because you never know. My next video might just be helpful too.